joy to welcome Heather McKee back again as a member of the program. It was
2 years ago.
Right. But Heather does so much for the church, serving here as a ruling elder. She is one of the two teachers of the Maloney class. She co-chairs the Social Justice Committee, and so much more. And just, I think an inspiration. Heather, of course, got an undergraduate degree from the college and then got a master's of divinity from Princeton, and yet was denied the opportunity for ordination by our denomination. And yet, despite that, she is here serving in a volunteer capacity, doing so much for this very church. So thank you and welcome back.
Thank you, Jesse. That's such a kind introduction. And thank you for the invitation to be with you all this morning. Every time I'm honored to be part of Covenant class, it's with the spirit of Tony Abbott in my heart and mind. And Tony created such an amazing community of folks where rigorous intellectual inquiry and heartfelt faith meet. So it's in that spirit that I hope we can begin a discussion over the next 3 weeks of what can be difficult topics. And I want to honor the fact that sexuality and gender, many of us have had trauma and maybe have suffered some abuse or violence because of our sexuality and or gender. I honor everyone's experience of that here. I want to also mention the fact that if you were in the class 2 years ago, I'm going to cover some of the stuff we went over 2 years ago because I think it's foundational. But there'll be some new information because what's wonderful is that our ideas about sexuality and gender are now evolving, growing, and our denomination, the PCUSA, is doing a really great job helping to educate us on ways that God's expansive love and our understanding of sexuality and gender is changing. But what I want to do today is focus more on sexuality. Next week, we'll move into gender. And then our third week together, we'll talk about some ways that we as members of DCPC, which you hear, I'm sure on Sunday mornings, that we are a welcoming and affirming church. That means that we fully embrace and celebrate different diverse genders, different diverse sexualities. So that third week, we'll talk about ways we can live into that a little bit more and work to help heal places where there has been trauma or abuse around different sexualities and genders. So that'll be the structure of our time together. So I want to begin today talking about sexuality. Now, everybody has a sexuality. Everybody has a sexual identity or a sexual orientation. So when we talk about that, we're all talking about ourselves and how we are attracted to people. And there are different dimensions of those attractions. So if you think about your own life and the people that, the person you may have fallen in love with when you were a kid or the person you're married to now, think about those different types of attractions you have. You can be sexually attracted to someone, physically, emotionally, intellectually, all sorts of different ways that attractions figure in. And that's part of who we are as relational human beings. So we all have sexual identity and we all have a sexual orientation too. But what we're going to talk about today, because it is actually LGBTQ History Month. Didn't know if you knew that. So learn something new in Covenant every time. So we're going to talk a little bit today, the scope of history primarily beginning in post-war America. And the way sexuality has played out in our denomination and some of the conflicts, some of the progress that we've made. And we're going to focus too on the biblical texts, because the biblical texts are not static, because we have transmission of those texts, which is the way those original manuscripts from the Greek and the Hebrew were put together over time and created into this collection that we call the Bible. And then we have translation of these texts. And you'll see how that is a very dynamic, changing process over time. And Jesse and I were just talking that there's a new version, and I use what's called the NRSV, which is a standard version that I started using when I went to seminary. It's considered kind of the gold standard for scholarship. But I also want to emphasize that there are many, many, many versions of this text. You're probably familiar with the NIV, Living Bible, Common English Bible, on and on and on. And each of these particular versions are the result of translation teams that at various points in history have gone back and looked at the text and translated the original Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic in some cases into the language that would be understandable for their target audience, right? So the Bible's been translated in many, many different languages. And in English, we have the King James in 1611. And then around the turn of the century was the American Standard Version. And then in 1946 through 1951, the RSV. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some pretty significant changes that happened there. So we have transmission, we have translation, and then there's interpretation of text. So what do we make of this? How do we interpret it? And what are the criteria we use for interpreting biblical texts? And then we have the dissemination of those interpretations. And there are many ways those interpretations are disseminated from the pulpit. So when our ministers get up and preach a sermon, they're taking a particular interpretation and disseminating it and teaching it to a congregation. Another way that interpretations are disseminated are through commentaries and other writings. So a lot of times when ministers are preparing for sermons, they'll go to a commentary like the International Commentary, the Cambridge. There are a whole bunch of them. So that's where they can gain some understanding of the text. But that's just a little bit of background on our denomination's relationship with the biblical text and kind of how that understanding works out. But what I wanted to do today is share with you a video that has been made by a new friend of mine. Now, Dr. Mark Octomer, some of you may have heard of him, or you may have heard of his parents, Elizabeth and Paul Octomer, who very active Presbyterians. Mark lives in Montreat. He is now retired, but he has an amazing background. He was a professor at Dubuque Theological Seminary, which was one of our PCUSA seminaries, and has his PhD in theology. He's a biblical scholar. And what's fascinating about Mark is that he started out and still identifies as a committed evangelical within the PCUSA. So during the debates over ordination over the place of LGBTQ people in the church. Mark was not on my side, to put it mildly. But he had a profound experience, which I have discovered to be true of many people, is that he started to think of the relationships that he had. He started to meet LGBTQ Christians and really get to know them. And he tells the story of when he was teaching a young female seminarian came to him, and he didn't know, her sexual identity, but she came out to him and told him, and it said it just hit him like a ton of bricks because he saw her as one of the most committed, gifted people that he was working with at the time. And it caused him to have some cognitive dissonance, to really rethink, why am I working so hard to prevent this person who is so clearly committed and gifted from seeking ordination? So that was in the late 90s. So that led him back to the text to re-examine his assumptions. So I'm going to show the video, and actually, I hope that I can ask John Ryan to allow me to put a lot of resources. I don't know if there's a way to do that, because I would commend you to watch. It's a 4-part series of interviews with Mark. And we just have time to show one. But the one I'm going to show you today focuses on what we call those clobber texts. I don't know if you've heard of that yet. The 6 texts that have been, I want to say, the dominant culture has used to condemn LGBTQ people. Mark calls them the fragment text. You may have heard the term proof texting, where people will grab texts out of context and weaponize them against particular groups. So Mark's going to address those 6 texts in a way only, one of the best theologians and biblical scholars I know could do. So let me see if I can put this on. So I share my screen. And then I'm a newbie, y'all. Here we go. Here we go. And this video was actually produced about 2015. So it's a little dated, but I think it's worth watching.
In today's heated conversations about marriage and sexuality, arguments and controversies often seem to come back to one question. But what does the Bible say? And the answer often takes participants through a series of familiar texts, those that have traditionally been understood to condemn homosexuality, to disallow same-sex marriage. But what if we're reading them wrong? I'm Brian Ellison with the Covenant Network of Presbyterians. Dr. Mark Octomer, in his book, The Bible's Yes to Same-Sex Marriage, explores his journey of coming to see Scripture's teaching through a broader, a more complete lens. As a strong evangelical, he was and is committed to taking the Bible seriously, to digging into the Scriptures in search of their truth for our lives. In previous videos, Dr. Octomer outlined various principles that our faith tradition has used for interpreting Scriptures, especially when their demands seemed troubling or inconsistent with what we believe about God's nature and faithful living. Those familiar texts, sometimes called clobber passages or fragment passages, demand close attention, beginning with those sections of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. Dr. Octomer found that the sexual behavior those passages condemn may not be as obvious as traditional teaching might have us believe.
Now, one of these time-tested principles for how you interpret the Bible that's been developed over the centuries is you always look at passages in their historical and biblical contexts. And so as I read about the history that lay behind these passages in the Bible, I discovered that same-sex behaviors in biblical times are very, very different from loving, mutually committed, same-gender relationships and marriages that we think about today. Same-gender marriage just isn't on the radar screen of the biblical writers. There's, in fact, no one word for homosexuality in either Greek or Hebrew. So it's a very different situation that the biblical writers are speaking to. So you take a passage like Leviticus 18 or 20, which forbids a man lying with another man as with a woman. And I started wondering, okay, what would be the situations in the biblical world in which that kind of activity would take place? It's obviously not a marriage situation because that, again, isn't on the radar screen, hasn't occurred to anyone. So what sort of situations would that kind of activity be at home in? And I decided the most reliable and helpful way to answer that question was to let the Bible answer it. So I went back looking through the Old Testament for what kind of same-gender behaviors actually get a more detailed description. Well, one of the most detailed is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, which is regularly used to categorically condemn same-sex relationships. It's an interesting story. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah have a terrible reputation. God sends two angels on a fact-finding mission to go see what's up with these cities. Now, these angels look like ordinary men, and they travel to the city of Sodom, and they find shelter and hospitality offered by Lot, who is there in the city, sees them hanging around the town square, not really having any place to go, invites them into his house, cooks them dinner, is going to put them up for the night. Just act of hospitality toward these strangers. Well, at this point, the story turns very dark, and an angry mob of the citizens of Sodom come together, besieging Lot's house, demanding that he turn over these strangers so that they may know them. And of course, that's a biblical euphemism for sexual activity. These strangers are against any kind of foreigners being in their city. And so what this is a threat of gang rape as a way of punishing these outsiders for invading their territory and to make it never happen again. Lot tries to reason with the crowd. They point out that he's a foreigner too. He wasn't born in the city, and say they'll treat him even worse. Well, after this scene goes on for a while, the angels intervene, and they miraculously strike the mob with blindness, and the mob disperses, and the angels escape, along with Lot and his family, and then God rains down fire from heaven to destroy the wicked cities. So this is an example of the same-sex behavior Leviticus is talking about. This is where males lie with males. It's weaponized. It is gang rape deployed as a weapon to keep foreigners out of our territory. And I looked at that and said to myself, I agree with condemning that. I think gang rape's a bad idea. In fact, it fits the pattern It certainly does not promote faithful, complete gift of oneself to another person after the pattern of Christ. So if that was the kind of behavior we're talking about, the Genesis prohibition made the Leviticus prohibition made perfect sense. There's a very similar story in Judges 19. Again, situation where strangers come into a village and receive hospitality. Once again, you get an angry mob threatening them with rape. In this particular story, one of the concubines of one of the travelers is thrown to the mob, and she is raped and killed. And of course, the Bible judges this very, very harshly. This is a terrible crime that in fact provokes a war of revenge between the Benjaminites and and some of the other Israelite tribes. But I started thinking, nobody looks at that story of heterosexual gang rape, which the Bible condemns, and says, oh, therefore the Bible must condemn heterosexual marriage. So why would it make sense to take a story of same-gender gang rape and conclude from that, oh, God must condemn same-gender marriage? It makes absolutely no sense. Now, as I looked through the Old Testament, there was only one other instance of same-gender sexual activity, and you find this in references to cult prostitutes that's scattered through various Old Testament texts. These were male prostitutes who took part in the idolatrous worship rites that were carried on by the pagan tribes that surrounded Israel and their settlement in Palestine. And the Bible condemns these, and I could too. I think cultic prostitution is a terrible thing. And so, once again, the pattern I had found seemed to be upheld with these traditional texts, that none of these promoted Christ-like self-giving to another person, so they were all condemned, and rightly so. So the next step was to go to the New Testament passages and look at those.
One of Dr. Octomeyer's most striking observations was also one of the most obvious. None of the behaviors condemned in reference to homosexuality in the Old Testament were marriage behaviors. Cult prostitution, gang rape, but nothing resembling sexuality as part of a covenanted or committed partnership. He says the same was true when he looked at the New Testament texts.
There's one other historic same-sex behavior in the background of the New Testament, and that is this Greek institution of pederasty, which is this very odd arrangement between older men and young pubescent boys, where the older men exchange philosophical training and social sponsorship for sexual favors. And this arrangement has its own set of conventions. It's considered terribly shameful if the younger partner derives any pleasure from it. Boys just about the time they're hitting adolescence are thought of as ideal, and by the time they start growing a full beard, well, then they're too old for this, and then you find a new boy. It is not a substitute for marriage. The men who engage in this typically have wives. There's no expectation it's going to last. So this whole institution of pederasty also had very, very little relationship to a loving, committed, lifelong gift of selves to one another like we'd find in a marriage. So this, along also with the violent and idolatrous behaviors, are what stand in the background of the New Testament passages. One of the most prominent passages in the New Testament case is Romans 1, where Paul makes a very disparaging reference to people who give up a natural course of their sexuality for unnatural partners here. And this has typically been used to condemn gay and lesbian relationships across the board. But when you read this passage in its biblical context, it occurs as part of a longer argument Paul is making, which actually has its conclusion around Romans 3:21, where Paul is wanting to argue everybody is a sinner and everybody is therefore stands as recipients of the good news of salvation by grace through faith in Jesus. Now, Paul's problem is he has very pious Jewish Christian hearers who think we do a pretty good job of following God's will, thank you very much. And so Paul has to convince them that they are sinners who stand in need of Christ's grace too. So the way Paul does this is to set a little rhetorical trap for them, and he does this by appealing to their prejudices against the Greek and Roman pagans. And so Romans 1 is his description of this. He says these are terrible people who have substituted the worship of the true God for idols and put birds and animals and reptiles as the objects of worship where God should be. And in the process, God gives them up, and you get all of these terrible sexual behaviors, which, we know from the Greeks. You rape your slaves and prisoners of war, and there's the whole pederasty thing. And he goes on and on and on with lists about how they don't respect their parents, and they're liars and cheaters and awful people. And you can just kind of hear his audience in the background going, yeah, preach it, brother, these pagans, they're so terrible. The most popular sermons I've ever preached are the ones who condemn those other people over there, who really deserve it. And so Paul is doing this, but then he gets to the beginning of the second chapter and he springs his trap. And he says, you pious Jewish Christians, in passing judgment against your neighbors, are doing the same thing the pagans do. Because what you are doing is taking a function that only belongs to God, which is judging people, and you're putting a creature in that position, namely yourself. So Paul's whole point here is that in judging their pagan neighbors, these people have committed this same terrible sin of substituting creatures for God that the pagans have been doing. So it's ironic in the extreme that anybody takes this passage and uses it to judge gay and lesbian people in their relationship. And we see here, in fact, Paul's reference to these relationships takes place in passing, and it's just designed to appeal to the prejudice of his hearers against the terrible behaviors the Greeks and the Roman pagans engage in, which, again, any sensible person, including me, would condemn. So Romans turned out, as I looked at it, to be not at all a suitable foundation for condemning gay and lesbian marriages. It wasn't talking about those kind of behaviors at all. And in fact, as I went through the rest of the New Testament texts, I found the same pattern occurring over and over again. These are references in passing to obviously terrible behaviors, and it's all referencing things I could condemn without question, and also without affecting in any way my conclusion that God wants to bless gay and lesbian loving marriages. I realized this understanding of the Bible held within itself the possibility for the church to find its voice again in speaking to contemporary culture about love, marriage, and sexuality. So often I think the church's sexual teaching has taken the form of arbitrary lists of rules that don't seem to have any rhyme or reason to them. What I had uncovered about God's purposes and God's desire to bless people in relationships, both same-sex and heterosexual, allows us to give the reasons for why traditional Christian teaching about sexuality makes sense. And that traditional teaching applies to same-gender relationships and traditional heterosexual relationships. So I sensed here there was a real opportunity for the church to make much more sense to people than it has in the past.
Dr. Octomer says he regarded this as a breakthrough moment. He didn't need to disregard the scriptures for the church to make more sense. In fact, he needed to read them with an even higher level of devotion and understanding. The Old and New Testament texts that have traditionally been applied to gay and lesbian sexuality could be seen as what they really are: anything but a condemnation of loving, faithful relationships between consenting and committed adults, grounded in love and mutual commitment to Christ and one another. Still, he knew it represented a major change in how many understood these passages. In our next video, we'll hear about the precedent Dr. Octomer found for such a dramatic shift in understanding, and we'll consider what it could mean for the difficult questions facing the church today. Until then, keep working for a church as generous and just as God's grace.
Okay. Let me see if I can exit out of that. Okay. Okay. Stop. It stopped on its own. Okay, now I had to do this. I'm sorry, y'all. Okay. So I want to open our up to discussion, and John Ryan has told me that I must repeat your questions or must repeat your comments so our friends who are joining us on the internet can hear. So any reactions to Dr. Octomer's? Bill.
The Leviticus, I taught 8th grade, you might be able to hear me. The Leviticus passage is interpreted in the Bible.
Right.
In Ezekiel, very clearly is inhospitality and mistreatment of strangers, which is a universal concept in the ancient world, that you must treat visitors as kindly as possible. It's the 1100 AD, I believe, when homosexuality is first applied to that in any written text. And it's pretty obscure until I believe it's Aquinas who makes it a big deal.
Yeah, but so Bill's comment was that the Bible interprets itself. So in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel looks back at Leviticus and the Sodom and Gomorrah story and says the sins of Sodom were inhospitality to foreigners, to others. And as Bill rightly points out, hospitality was a central ethical. It was the foundation of cultures in the ancient Near East, because imagine they didn't have Holiday Inns, right? So if you're a traveler coming through, your life depends on someone giving you water, someone giving you shade, someone giving you food. So the Bible, and Dr. Octomer said the Bible interprets itself many, many times. And Bill also went on to say that it wasn't until later in Christian history that the concept of sodomy kind of entered into the tradition. And that's a fascinating story. And Aquinas was part of that. There was a monk, I think in the 10th century, named Peter Damian. And Peter Damian also started to insert this new concept of sodomy as a sexual sin, as opposed to a sin of not providing hospitality, which is what Ezekiel says in the Bible it's about. And unfortunately, that tradition, remember we talked about dissemination? That interpretation was disseminated into the biblical text. Because if you look at the King James Version, which was written in 1611, in New Testament text, in particular in 1 Corinthians 6:9, which I'll talk a little bit about in greater detail, you'll see that there's a vice list that Paul talks about, and there are two Greek words, arsekenetai and malakos. And one of those words literally means, malakos literally means soft. The other, arsekenetoi, is a neologism that Paul made up. And if you break it down into the Greek, it means man better. Well, what happened is the King James Version took that arsekenetoi and inserted the word sodomy on there. And that started a whole tradition of use of that word that not only entered into the religious realm, but out into culture, out into the legal corpus. You know, because remember sodomy laws? You know, we had them here up until, gosh, the 90s. I think it was what, Lawrence versus Jesse, my lawyer can help me, but yeah. So Anthony Kennedy, remember Justice Kennedy, wrote the opinion on that, and you know, striking down sodomy laws in the United States. You have to go all the way back to understand how these misinterpretations or misinterpretations get disseminated and then infiltrate into the culture. Any other observations, questions? Pam. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, the same pattern of misinterpretation in Europe, are they as
Interesting.
about it as women did for the men or kids, women did right? We see that most recently
Pam, those are great questions. Yeah, I'm going to repeat Pam's. Pam asks, do we see these types of interpretations, translations in other languages? And then also, when Dr. Octomer talks about that violent undertone, the aggression that really is at the root of these particular passages, was the mistranslation something that has happened recently, or was it before? I want to pull up, I have a cool chart that goes through the 1 Corinthians 9, various translations over time. In 1946, remember I talked about the RSV, that first translation post King James in the United States. That translation inserted the word homosexual into the Bible for the very first time. 1946. Now, what was going on in the world? War, right? Post-war America. Now, scholars disagree about why this happened to an extent. Some say that the insertion of the word homosexual was a corrective to the use of the term sodomy, done intentionally to modernize the Bible so readers and culture would be able to understand it. I disagree with that. And there's some emerging scholarship about the context in which these translations happened. Now, keep in mind, translation committees are human beings, and they come with their own set of biases and cultural, enculturation. So a gentleman named Luther Weigel was the head of the RSV Translation Committee in 1946. And along with 10 other white, highly educated males, they had the power to determine what the Bible said. And so you have this historical context of the US coming out of World War II. What was happening after World War II? What were some of the boogeymen out there? Right? Remember Joe McCarthy? The Red Scare. But there was something else going on too. Something called the Lavender Scare, in which the State Department in particular was being purged of quote unquote sexual perverts, of anyone who wouldn't sign a loyalty oath, which included, rejection of communism, the godless communists, remember that? So what was happening was there was this conflation of gay people with communists. So you had Roy Cohn, you had McCarthy, and you had others that were actively outing, seeking out, and pushing out members of the LGBT community who were in government. And in fact, in 1953, Eisenhower signed an executive order that made it impossible for an out LGBTQ person to get a security clearance, a civilian. And it wasn't until 1995 that Bill Clinton signed an executive order that reversed that. So think about that time. You had America coming out of World War II. You had this new translation of these texts that inserts for the very first time the term homosexual, which, by the way, when you read the Greek, does not include women, right? Malakos, arsakenetoi, those are male. If you understand Greek, those are male endings. So all of a sudden, you have a category of people that you can target. You can use as scapegoats, because it was still dangerous in society to be different in any way, So I'm of the opinion that yes, post-war America, that kind of ushered in a very new and dangerous way of targeting what we now call LGBTQ people. But that is not to say, and I want to make this point pretty clear, there have always been gay LGBTQ people in the church, always. And these understandings of text that Dr. Octomer mentioned are not new. When we think of the Christian tradition, it is not univocal. It is multivocal. One of the things I did when I was in seminary and I was confronted with this was I was actually kind of shocked, because I guess I was naive, but I started doing my own research, and there were professors in 1991 at Princeton Seminary who said, that's wrong. Here, let me show you what it is. But yet, they were not the ones that had the ecclesial power to make the decisions that were made that prevented me from getting ordained. But these traditions within traditions of interpretation and translation were not univocal. So that's a very long answer to a very good question, and I apologize for that. Any other thoughts? Oh, one thing I did learn in preparation for this class is Do you know that heterosexuals used to be considered perverts? Yeah. Back in the 1870s, at the dawn of the kind of the psychoanalytic and sexology age, what would happen was these like doctors or these sexologists would set up shop, and they would have folks come to see them about their problems. And primarily in Germany, that's where psychoanalytic theory originated. So you'd have folks come in, and this one case study in particular kind of is interesting. Kerbner, I think his name is, would see patients, and one of his patients, who was a married man, came in and was troubled by his attraction to female handkerchiefs. He had a fetish, a paraphilia. Now, Kirchner spun that out to coin a new term called heterosexual based on his encounter with this person who was troubled by a particular paraphilia they had. And again, how these things get disseminated and change over time. So for a good period of time, the term heterosexual was considered a perversion, but that changed over time. And then you had the development of the term homosexual out of kind of that same milieu of the German psychoanalytic tradition. And again, that term came out of what we would consider a clinical population, people going to like Dr. Freud or others with problems. Many of them were actually in institutional settings, but talked about, their attraction maybe to someone of their gender. And so it was pathologized. And another, if you remember, the American Psychological Association had in their DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, homosexuality as a disease, as a mental disorder, up until 1973, when it was taken out. So again, this post-war, homosexuality put in the Bible, it's a disease, so you have this just cascading effect of ways to weaponize and identify folks. So. Any other thoughts? Ben. Good question. They tend to move in glacial time. But Van, that's a good question. Van asks, when will the Catholic Church come around? Or will they? What has been interesting over the past 10 years has been a retreat in Protestant circles from using the Clobber Text to justify anti-LGBTQ ideologies. But the retrenchment has been back to something called complementarianism, which is going back to Genesis and saying, well, God created the male and female, and the purpose of sexual activity is procreation. So that's kind of where I think the majority of the Catholic teaching is now. So unless and until they start to read Genesis with a little bit more nuance, I think they're not going to move off of that. So, Jane? Oh, yeah. So Jane asked me to mention the Heidelberg Catechism. Now, for those of us who've grown up in the Presbyterian tradition, you know that our church institution is comprised of two documents. One is our Book of Order, which lists, the ways, our policy, ways we govern ourselves. And the other is called our Book of Confessions. And that's a collection of historical documents that inform who we are as members of the Reformed tradition. Now, remember I talk about, I'm going to say the word again, dissemination. There's one of our confessions that we have is called the Heidelberg Confession. And there's a segment in there that echoes the 1 Corinthians 6:9 vice list, but it does not include the word Sodom in there and doesn't have any reference to like a sexual activity, really. It's more greed, lust, that kind of stuff. But in 1963, a couple guys decided they would add the word homosexual with no context whatsoever. Literally, the line, if you look back in earlier versions, had a period, and they put in the term homosexual to that vice list, 1963. And it wasn't until the 221st General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church that that word was removed. So think about a generation of us that grew up, learning, seeing these fabrications inserted into the text, and in my view, for political purposes. Power. What Dr. Octomer doesn't really mention a lot is the patriarchal structures of the biblical texts. Not just the biblical texts too, but the cultures that surrounded them. And I want to amplify something in that all of the aggressive, the violent behavior that underlies these Clobber texts is also informed by social structures where men dominate, have power over everyone else. Particularly in the Greco-Roman culture, male citizens had complete control over women, non-citizens, they're slaves, and in pederasty, you can see they used these younger men for their own pleasure or gain. So you have these cultures out of which these texts arise, where there is a presumption of male dominance. And so we have to wrestle with that when these texts.
Heather,
Yes.
I'm on Zoom.
Hi.
That almost
Voice of
sounds
God.
that almost sounds like the some of the current Christian right. When you mention that white male dominance, certainly in the family, we have friends down in Georgia whose Presbyterian church split because of this whole issue of homosexuality, and I look at it. They in my sense of them is they have a covert prejudice not only about gay, lesbian, but also Black culture and minorities, and I think that that's somewhat pervasive in that whole processing.
Right. That's a great point. Bill. Yeah, and I want to take a moment to say that, I stand before you as a privileged white female, and the experiences of Black, brown, indigenous, LGBTQ people are different in this world. And, we talk, Social Justice Committee, we talk a lot about the intersectional natures of oppression, and that how, with a white male, a white supremacist structure, that oppression hits others. And, that's not unlike the way the Greco-Roman culture operated. Thank you for that. Bill.
Preaching to the people in Corinth who, I think it's his second visit to Corinth, not second Corinthians, not to the first. So And I was there visiting Rose, who grew up in
Uh-huh.
Pittsburgh, and spent 4 or 5 days there and arranged for me to have free reign of the ruins. So I
Wow.
spent my days wandering through it, enjoying it. At one point, I was in the assembly where people assembled for anything,
Uh-huh.
and the dais, the bema they call it,
Mm-hmm.
where Paul was speaking, and the area where the people hearing him would have assembled, standing. Both of them have a straight-on view of the Acropolis. It's about 1,600-1,700 feet high. It's a huge mountain rather than the Greek or the Athenian Acropolis, which is a nice hill.
Right.
And there's the temple of Aphrodite, where temple prostitutes.
Wow.
And they're looking at that as he's making this pronunciation.
Wow.
It's not said, but whatever tour guide I heard that day, it was really interesting to watch the reaction. And he's simply pointing out
That's what they're.
visual cues that the hearers would have had, which of course doesn't show up in the text at all.
Yeah. So Bill just talked about having visited Corinth and where the likely place was where Paul was, where Paul's letter was being read. You could see on a hill the temple of Aphrodite where cultic prostitution happened. So, and of course that isn't captured in the text, but you can just imagine how over there, that's, so thanks. That's an amazing story. Any other? Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Falling apart, that people just go rigid, or condemnation, trying to order what they see.
Right. So Pam raised a good point about how, when we in 1963 was kind of the beginning of a sense that norms were being broken. We had the beginning of the Vietnam War, the very beginning, and in those types of times, do we think that there's a tendency to gravitate toward a more rigid condemnation understanding of the world? Think that there's an element of that that's very true. And let's think about our own time. Are we making America great again? This nostalgia. It's nostalgia for mythological periods of time when, at least in the memory of a community or a group, where their particular structure of society was dominant, right? So there is a tendency, I think, when groups and societies feel like their value system is being usurped or undercut, that there's a tendency to look back with a fuzzy kind of collective memory to say, those were the good old days, and we really need to bring everybody back to this so we can maintain our position of power. So, just my take on that. But quickly, I want to thank you all so much for being here today. And next week we'll continue on with a discussion of gender. We're going to talk some more about vocabulary too next week, because our words are so important. the way will you hand those out, please? So the way we use our words, and language is not static. Language is dynamic. Language is changing. So what I have for you today is a resource from the PCUSA that gives some definitions of the vocabulary that we are using now to talk about sexualities and genders. And I found it very helpful, and I hope that you will too. And thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks. Thank you.